Why are you not allowing her to answer the question? There's not another senator here that you've not allowed her to answer the question. I'm not asking another question, but allow her to answer the question, Chairman Durbin.
A back and forth between Senators Ted Cruz and Dick Durbin, epitomizing this week's contentious confirmation hearings for President Biden's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. We're joined now by Jessica Levinson. She's a professor of law and the director of Loyola Law School's Public Service Institute. Professor Levinson, thanks for joining us. So Republicans did most of the talking here during these hearings. It focused a lot on culture war topics, critical race theory, abortion, guns, gender. Were you surprised?
I was perhaps naively surprised. Of course, the Senate Judiciary Committee is actually split, and we did hear from all 22 members, but it did feel like we heard from Republicans more in some sense, in that they really went after the same topics and same lines of attack over and over again. I'm surprised that they went not about the line of attack that she was soft on crime, because I think some of that is to be expected because she will be the first former federal public defender who's a Supreme Court justice. But the idea that she is soft on people who violate child pornography laws, when there is no there to this, when that accusation had been completely debunked, and suddenly it's not just one, not just two, but a number of Republican senators bringing that up as a theme, that really surprised me because it's baseless.
And a lot of people predicted that was going to come because of her record as a public defender. Republicans on the committee now, they want the court filings, including those pre-sentencing reports in relation to the case you were just talking about. That includes confidential information about victims in those child porn cases. That was rejected. What did you make of that?
So what I made of that is that these confirmation hearings, we always know are political theater, but this was more like a political horror show. The idea that you could look at her record and think that she's outside the mainstream, the idea that you could look at her record and think, yes, after her being confirmed by the Senate 3 times to different federal positions, including as a district court judge, including as a court of appeals judge, that now we need this confidential information to make an assessment. I'm surprised that this is the hill that Republicans decided to climb, because this is one of the most accomplished and experienced jurists we've seen nominated to the court in actually quite a while.
I personally was a little surprised that she declined to give her judicial philosophy. Isn't that an important factor when determining whether someone should sit on the nation's highest court? Don't they usually talk about that?
I think that's the name of the game when it comes to confirmation hearings. And interestingly, when I was talking to my students about this, I mentioned a memo that then a very young lawyer for the Department of Justice, who became Chief Justice John Roberts, wrote to Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, when she was going through her confirmation process. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but what he said basically is, don't commit. Try not to put yourself in any sort of box where they try and get you to say, yes, I will absolutely vote this way, or this is absolutely how I would approach a question like that. But make sure that you make it clear that you have the ability to answer all these questions, that you have a command of the doctrine and the issues. And so I wasn't surprised, frankly, to hear Judge Jackson do what we've heard so many other nominees do, which is say, well, I have a methodology and here's how I approach questions. Because these confirmation hearings, as I've said, they are largely theater. We don't learn a lot about the nominees other than maybe their temperament and how they do under fire from the Senate Judiciary Committee.
That's why it's so interesting to talk to you to get that kind of insight. And also, let's talk about just the historic nature of her nomination, right? Senator Cory Booker giving that impassioned speech about her earning her way there. Let's take a listen to that.
And you did not get there because of some left-wing agenda? You didn't get here because of some dark money groups? You got here how every black woman in America who's gotten anywhere has done, by being, like Ginger Rogers said, I did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards in heels.
That was a pretty poignant moment. You saw the emotion on her face, no matter your politics, no matter what you think of her. That was a moment that will be remembered.
Absolutely. That was a moment that I think really changed the energy in the room. I mean, people can agree or disagree with Senator Booker and his politics and, frankly, his approach, but it absolutely changed the energy in the room, at least for that period of time. And I think he reminded people of maybe what was good to remind them of in that moment, which is that it's 2022 and this is a historic first. We have never had a female African-American Supreme Court justice. And maybe less importantly, we've never had a former federal public defender on the Supreme Court. And he spent some time, I think, frankly, rehabilitating her, reminding people of the historic nature of this particular confirmation hearing and humanizing the experience.
And there's been a lot of talk about this affirmative action case before the court involving Harvard. She said she would recuse herself from that. That's her alma mater, and she does sit on a board. Does that issue go away now for her? Does that take away the potential attacks or the potential accusations of conflict of interest?
You know, with respect to that particular issue, maybe, but listening to the questioning from the Senate Judiciary Committee, I'm loath to say the attacks go away, this issue goes away. I think these attacks will plague her for quite a while. And the question will be once, when and if she becomes a Supreme Court justice, will it plague her that she was very likely confirmed maybe by a tie-breaking vote as opposed to people she replaced, because we're just not in that space anymore. She's going to replace her former boss, Justice Breyer. He overwhelmingly got support from the Senate. That's not her so much as that's not the world we live in anymore. Question is whether or not it will make her more, for instance, tepid on the court. It doesn't seem to have affected Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Barrett.
Okay, really fast before we go, because we are out of time, but I want to get to Justice Thomas. Stephen, the Washington Post has that breaking news about his wife, Ginny's text messages to overturn the results of the 2020 election. That was the effort that led to an insurrection, just steps from the Supreme Court. This was the alleged conduct of a spouse, not a justice himself. But was he complicit, and would that matter?
So if the Judicial Code of Conduct was applicable to the Supreme Court justices, in this case, it's just suggestive, not mandatory, then you would see that a spouse, it's either the judge, him or herself, or the spouse, has an interest in the particular case, then based just on the appearances, you would say, yes, he should recuse himself. Of course, we know that there is no mandatory judicial code of ethics when it comes to the Supreme Court. If you look at appearances, if you care about the integrity of the Supreme Court, the better decision here is to recuse himself. He won't, and that's the world we live in on the Supreme Court. There's no watchdog over the Supreme Court. They are literally supreme.
All right. Well,
thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.